beast off my lawn right now, or I'm calling the pound!
The neighborhood had always seemed like the kind of place people dreamed about. Rows of identical homes lined manicured streets, trimmed hedges framed every walkway, and seasonal flowers bloomed in neat little squares at the ends of driveways. It was the kind of neighborhood where the mailboxes matched, the lawns were measured, and the homeowners association believed it was their sworn duty to make sure every blade of grass stood upright at the exact same angle. To outsiders, it looked perfect. To those who lived there, it was a place where perfection came at a cost. The ever-watchful eyes of the HOA, and the neighbors who acted like unpaid deputies. When I moved in, I knew I wasn't just bringing myself. My companion, a large golden retriever named Max, came with me. Max wasn't just a pet. He was a service dog, trained to help me manage a medical condition that wasn't visible to most people but changed my daily life in ways only I truly understood. Max was my guardian, my partner, and in many ways, my lifeline. To me, he wasn't optional. He was necessary. At first, everything was fine. Most neighbors waved politely when they saw Max trotting beside me, wearing his bright service vest. A few kids stopped to pet him when I gave permission, their parents thanking me for letting them. Life seemed normal, calm, even promising. But perfection never lasts long in a neighborhood controlled by people who thrive on control. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter. A crisp white envelope sat tucked under my doormat one morning, the HOA logo stamped in bold ink across the front. Inside, the message was short, cold, and to the point. The letter stated that I was in violation of the community's pet policy. According to their rules, dogs over a certain weight were not permitted within the neighborhood. The notice ended with a warning. I had 7 days to resolve the issue. At first, I laughed it off. It had to be a mistake. Service dogs, I knew, were legally protected under federal law. No HOA, no matter how strict, could ban a service animal. It was common knowledge. I tossed the letter aside, assuming it was the kind of bureaucratic slip-up that would correct itself once someone actually looked at my paperwork. But the letters didn't stop. 2 days later, another appeared, this one more aggressive. It included threats of fines and even legal action if I didn't comply. The tone was no longer professional. It was personal. Someone wasn't just filing complaints through the HOA. Someone had decided Max was a problem, and they weren't going to stop until he was gone. That's when I found out who it was. Karen. Every neighborhood has one, and ours was no exception. She lived 3 houses down in a home that looked identical to mine but had a yard trimmed within an inch of its life. She was the type of person who counted how long trash bins stayed on the curb and measured the distance between holiday lights to make sure no one's decorations outshone hers. She had appointed herself as the unofficial enforcer of the HOA's rules, and in her mind, that gave her power. Karen claimed Max barked too loudly, though my dog was trained to remain calm in nearly every situation. She claimed he frightened her when I walked him past her yard, even though Max's leash never extended beyond my side. She claimed his very presence lowered the value of her property. One afternoon, as I returned from a walk with Max, she stood on her porch with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Though she never spoke directly to me in that moment, the glare she gave said it all. She wanted him gone. From then on, things escalated quickly. The HOA began issuing fines, small at first, then larger. I received threats of liens on my property, warnings of legal battles, and even the possibility of eviction. Karen's influence in the HOA became clear. She wasn't just complaining, she was pulling strings, convincing board members that my service dog was nothing more than a nuisance. The pressure mounted, but with every letter I received, I became less willing to back down. Max wasn't just a pet. He wasn't a hobby or a choice I could easily discard. He was essential. Losing him wasn't an option. I started documenting everything, every letter, every fine, every interaction. I researched the law, diving deep into federal protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I learned not only that the HOA couldn't force me to remove Max, but that their very actions could place them in serious legal jeopardy. What began as a personal attack on me suddenly looked like the HOA and Karen were walking straight into a storm they didn't understand. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. I wasn't the one in danger. They were. Still, the stress was heavy. Each day I worried about what would come next. Another fine, another letter, another confrontation. Max remained steady, his calm presence grounding me when my frustration boiled over. And while Karen strutted through the neighborhood, convinced she was winning, I was quietly preparing my counterattack. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just a homeowner with a dog. I was about to become her worst nightmare, a homeowner with the law on his side. The stage was set. The HOA had made its move. Karen had shown her hand. Now it was my turn! And when I finally struck back, the neighborhood would never be the same again. The days following the first wave of warnings were some of the most exhausting I'd ever faced. What had started as a single complaint had snowballed into a full-scale campaign against me. Each morning seemed to bring a new envelope stuffed into my mailbox or tucked under my doormat, each one stamped with the same sharp, accusatory logo of the HOA. The fines grew more outrageous by the week. $25 for unauthorized pet ownership, $50 for excessive noise disturbance, $100 for property devaluation by noncompliance. The list of violations seemed endless, and most of them had nothing to do with Max at all. Suddenly, my lawn was out of code, despite being freshly mowed. My trash bin was cited for being left out too long, even though I'd brought it in hours earlier than most of my neighbors. The HOA had shifted from targeting Max to targeting me, and the pattern was too obvious to ignore. Karen wasn't satisfied with just forcing me to get rid of my service dog. She wanted me gone completely. Every evening I'd take Max on his walk, and every evening Karen would be there. Sometimes on her porch, sometimes conveniently tending to her yard, but always watching. Her eyes followed us like a hawk, her lips pursed, her expression smug. It was as though she was waiting to catch Max, stepping one paw onto her grass so she could file yet another complaint. The psychological weight of it all was unbearable. Living in that neighborhood began to feel less like home and more like a battlefield. Every choice I made, when to mow, when to take out the trash, when to walk Max, was calculated, strategic, done with the knowledge that someone was documenting my every move. But what Karen and the HOA didn't realize was that I had been documenting them too. Every letter was scanned, every notice copied, every threat carefully preserved in a growing file on my desk. I created a log, recording dates, times, and incidents in meticulous detail. When Karen followed me in her car one afternoon while I walked Max, creeping slowly behind us until I turned a corner, I noted it down. When an HOA board member approached me in the street and reminded me about the pet weight limit, I wrote down every word. My evidence grew thicker by the day, each page becoming a weapon I knew I would one day unleash. Still, I wasn't ready yet. I needed them to dig their own hole deeper. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning. A letter arrived marked final notice. It claimed that if Max was not removed from the property within 7 days, the HOA would take legal action, including the possibility of placing a lien on my home. 7 days. 7 days to get rid of my service dog or face financial ruin. That letter wasn't just another threat. It was their official declaration of war. I could have called a lawyer that day. I could have filed a complaint with federal authorities immediately, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I let the clock tick down. Day after day, I walked Max proudly through the neighborhood, ignoring Karen's piercing stares and the muttered complaints I overheard from her friends on the board. With every step, I felt the tension build. The HOA was waiting for me to break, but I refused. On the 6th day, another letter arrived. This one didn't even bother with pleasantries. It was a summons to appear before the HOA board for a disciplinary hearing. The date was set for the following week, and the letter made it clear. Failure to comply would result in immediate legal escalation. I knew then that the showdown was inevitable. They had drawn their line in the sand, and now it was my turn to cross it. But before the hearing, something happened that pushed me past frustration into absolute determination. Late one evening, as I sat on my porch with Max lying calmly at my feet, I heard a noise across the street. Karen was outside with another neighbor, speaking loudly enough for her words to carry. She was boasting about how she had finally gotten rid of that dog and how people like him don't belong in this neighborhood. The words stung, not just because they were cruel, but because they revealed the truth. This had never been about a dog. It had never been about rules or fines or policies. This was personal. Karen didn't want me or Max here, and she was willing to bend the entire HOA to her will to make it happen. That night, as I organized my growing file of evidence, I made a decision. I would no longer play defense. I would no longer simply wait for the next letter, the next fine, the next threat. From this point forward, I would go on the offensive. I began reaching out to advocacy groups. I contacted state officials. I started researching case law involving HOAs and service animals. And the more I dug, the more confident I became. The law wasn't just on my side. It was overwhelmingly in my favor. What the HOA was doing wasn't just wrong. It was illegal. Every fine, every notice, every threat was evidence of discrimination, and the consequences for them would be severe. Karen believed she had the HOA's power behind her. What she didn't realize was that I had something far stronger, the federal government. The countdown to the hearing had begun. And when the day arrived, I would walk into that room not as a man under fire, but as the one holding the torch. The stage was set. The battle lines were drawn. And for the first time, I knew exactly how this war would end. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and heavy, as though the sky itself was warning of the storm about to break. For days, I had prepared, combing through every piece of evidence, highlighting laws and statutes, rehearsing in my mind how I would present the truth. But no amount of preparation could entirely ease the weight pressing against my chest as I walked Max one final time before heading to the HOA clubhouse. His calm presence beside me was steadying, as if he sensed the battle we were walking into. The HOA clubhouse sat at the edge of the neighborhood, a sterile little building that looked more like a dentist's office than a center of governance. The moment I stepped inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Rows of folding chairs were lined up neatly, though only a handful were occupied. A few curious neighbors had shown up to witness the spectacle. Whispers filled the air as eyes turned to me, then to Max. At the far end of the room sat the board. 5 members in matching polo shirts embroidered with the HOA logo, their expressions severe, their papers stacked neatly in front of them, and, of course, there she was, Karen, seated just off to the side. She wasn't technically a board member, but her presence was undeniable. Arms crossed, lips pursed in satisfaction. She looked like someone who had already won. The chair of the board cleared his throat and began. He read off a list of violations in a tone so flat and rehearsed it was almost robotic. Unauthorized animal, excessive barking, endangerment of property values, failure to comply with written notices. The list went on and on, each accusation landing like a drumbeat of condemnation. But as he spoke, I felt my fear melt away, because behind every accusation I saw the cracks. I knew the laws, the protections, the rights they were trampling over, and I knew that when it was my turn to speak, those cracks would become chasms. When the board finished, the chair looked up and asked if I had anything to say in my defense. That was the moment I had been waiting for. I began by calmly explaining Max's role as a service animal, emphasizing that his presence wasn't optional. It was a matter of medical necessity. I placed documentation on the table, certification of his training, and a letter from my physician. Then I went further. I outlined the Americans with Disabilities Act, quoting directly from federal statutes that guaranteed my right to keep Max in any housing, regardless of weight limits or HOA restrictions. The board shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but I wasn't finished. I pulled out the thick file I had prepared. Every letter, every fine, every threat. They were all there, meticulously documented and organized. I laid them out on the table one by one, describing the pattern of harassment, the targeting, the deliberate attempt to drive me out of the neighborhood. The room grew tense. Whispers from the spectators filled the air again. Karen's smug expression faltered, replaced with something tighter, more uncertain. And then I delivered the final blow. I explained that not only were the HOA's actions illegal, but they exposed the association to severe penalties under federal law. I mentioned that I had already reached out to advocacy groups and state authorities, and that I was prepared to escalate the matter if the harassment continued. In other words, I wasn't just defending myself, I was putting the entire HOA on trial. Silence filled the room when I finished. The board members exchanged glances, their confidence shaken. For the first time, it was clear they understood the gravity of the situation. What they had thought was a simple enforcement of neighborhood rules had transformed into a potential legal nightmare. Karen, however, couldn't contain herself. She leaned forward, her voice cutting through the quiet as she launched into a tirade. She insisted that Max was disruptive, dangerous, and unnecessary. She claimed that people like me were abusing the system and ruining the neighborhood. Her words dripped with venom, her frustration boiling over into the open for everyone to see. But in that moment, her outburst did more damage than anything I could have said. Neighbors watched her unravel, her prejudice laid bare for all to witness. The board tried to quiet her, but the damage was done. Her mask of self-righteousness had slipped, and everyone could see the truth. This wasn't about rules or order. This was about Karen's obsession with control. The chair of the board finally called the hearing to a close. He announced that the board would deliberate and issue a decision in writing within a week. His voice was strained, his composure fraying around the edges. I gathered my papers, clipped Max's leash, and walked out of that room with my head held high. The weight that had been pressing on me for weeks lifted, replaced by something else. Resolve. For the first time, I knew I wasn't just surviving this battle. I was winning it. But as I left, I caught sight of Karen. She stood just outside the door, glaring at me with a hatred so sharp it cut through the air. Her lips moved silently, but I didn't need to hear the words to understand. She wasn't finished. Not yet. The hearing had been a turning point, but it wasn't the end. Karen had lost her composure, but she still had influence, and I knew she would use it. She would find another angle, another scheme, another way to strike back. As I walked home, Max trotting faithfully by my side, I realized the fight was far from over. The board's decision was looming, but even beyond that, Karen was plotting, and if she wanted another war, I would be ready. The hearing had given me momentum, but it had also lit a fuse. The real explosion was still to come. The week following the hearing was filled with an uneasy silence. For days there were no letters, no fines, no knocks on my door. The HOA board had gone quiet, retreating into their deliberations, no doubt scrambling to figure out how to untangle themselves from the legal mess they had created. To anyone else, it might have seemed like the storm had passed. But I knew better. The silence wasn't peace. It was the calm before another strike. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. Losing her composure in front of the board, having her motives exposed. Watching her authority slip, it had left a wound to her pride that I knew she wouldn't allow to heal. For someone like Karen, control wasn't just a habit, it was her identity. And she would do anything to claw it back. At first, her revenge came in subtle ways. Trash mysteriously appeared on my lawn, though I hadn't put it there. Packages left at my doorstep were suddenly missing. A neighbor quietly mentioned seeing Karen loitering near my yard late at night, though she darted away before anyone could confront her. Each incident was small enough to brush off, but together they painted a clear picture. She was escalating, but trying to do it in a way that wouldn't leave fingerprints. But subtlety was never Karen's strength. One morning I woke to find a bright orange notice taped across my garage door. It wasn't from the HOA board this time. It was from Animal Control. The notice claimed that multiple complaints had been filed about Max. Accusations of aggression, excessive barking, and even attacking another dog. None of it was true. Max's training alone made such behavior impossible. But to an outsider, the stack of complaints might look damning. It didn't take long to figure out who had filed them. Karen had shifted her fight from the HOA to the county, weaponizing the system in a new way. By flooding Animal Control with false reports, she was trying to build a case to have Max forcibly removed. That moment was when the fear returned, not for me, but for Max. If Animal Control acted on those lies, he could be taken away, placed in a shelter, or worse. The thought made my blood boil. Karen wasn't just trying to inconvenience me anymore. She was trying to destroy the bond between me and the one being who kept me steady through everything. But fear quickly turned into resolve. I began collecting evidence again, this time focusing on Karen's harassment outside the HOA's reach. I installed cameras around my home, each one discreetly positioned to cover my yard, porch, and driveway. I kept logs of every suspicious incident, and when Animal Control officers arrived to investigate, I welcomed them inside, showed them Max's certifications, demonstrated his calm behavior, and handed over my growing file. The officers weren't blind, they recognized the pattern. After their second visit, one quietly advised me to keep everything documented, because false reporting itself was a serious offense. Karen had overplayed her hand again. But she wasn't finished. When her attempt with Animal Control faltered, she turned back to the HOA. Though the board had yet to issue their decision from the hearing, Karen began circulating flyers throughout the neighborhood. In bold letters, they warned that my dangerous dog was a threat to children and property values. She urged neighbors to protect their community by demanding Max's removal. The flyers spread like wildfire, tucked into mailboxes and taped to lampposts. Some neighbors ignored them, shaking their heads at Karen's obsession. But others began to whisper. Parents crossed the street when walking their kids past my house. Neighbors who had once waved now avoided eye contact. Slowly, Karen's campaign of fear began to divide the community. I could feel the isolation tightening around me, but I refused to break. Instead, I leaned into the evidence I had gathered. I reached out to local disability rights organizations, sending them copies of the flyers, the complaints, the harassment. Their response was swift. They would support me fully, and they encouraged me to escalate my complaint to federal authorities. Meanwhile, Karen grew bolder. One evening, as I returned from a walk with Max, I found her standing in the middle of the sidewalk blocking my path. Her eyes burned with hatred, her posture rigid. Though she didn't speak, the message was clear. She wanted me out, and she would stop at nothing. But what Karen didn't realize was that every move she made only strengthened my case. Every flyer, every false complaint, every attempt to rally the neighborhood, it was all evidence of harassment, intimidation, and discrimination. By the time the HOA board finally delivered their decision, I was ready for anything. The letter arrived in another crisp white envelope, but this time the tone was entirely different. The board acknowledged Max's status as a service animal and confirmed that the HOA's pet restrictions did not apply to him. All fines related to Max were rescinded, and the board announced that they would review their policies to ensure compliance with federal law. On paper, I had won. The HOA had backed down, conceding to the law they had once ignored. But victories on paper don't always translate to victories in reality, because while the board may have yielded, Karen hadn't. If anything, the decision only poured fuel on her fire. She had lost her biggest weapon, the HOA's backing, and now she was lashing out with nothing left to lose. And in that desperation, she was about to make her most reckless move yet. The neighborhood was no longer divided. It was a powder keg, ready to ignite. And I could feel the spark building, ready to set everything ablaze. The letter from the HOA board should have ended everything. It was clear, official, and final. Max was recognized as a service animal, the fines were rescinded, and the board promised to align their policies with federal law. To any rational person, that would have been the conclusion of the battle. The rules were clarified, the law was on my side, and the case was closed. But Karen wasn't rational. The board's decision didn't stop her. It broke her. The loss of her authority, the humiliation of being publicly undermined, the realization that she couldn't bend the HOA to her will anymore, it pushed her into uncharted territory. And when someone like Karen loses control, they don't retreat. They explode. The first explosion came in the form of vandalism. One night, I woke to the sound of scratching against my fence. By the time I rushed outside, the damage had already been done. Spray painted across the boards were the words, DOGOUT. The paint dripped in angry streaks, fresh enough that it stained my shoes as I stepped closer. Max stood beside me, silent but alert, his body tense as if he could sense the malice behind the act. I reported the vandalism immediately. The police came, took photos, and filed a report. But without witnesses, it was just another entry in the growing list of harassment. Still, I knew who was behind it. No one else in the neighborhood had such an obsession with me and Max. The vandalism was only the beginning. Within days, I found nails scattered across my driveway, sharp enough to puncture tires or injure paws. My mailbox was pried open, its contents strewn across the street. And one evening, I returned home to find my back gate swung open, as if someone had tried to lure Max out. Thankfully, his training kept him from wandering, but the thought chilled me to the bone. Karen had moved beyond complaints and flyers. She was taking direct action, reckless and dangerous. At first, I tried to respond the way I always had, with documentation. The cameras I'd installed captured blurry footage of a figure in the dark near my fence. But the resolution wasn't sharp enough to prove identity. I filed reports, logged incidents, and added every new piece of evidence to my growing case. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no longer just about winning a legal battle. This was about safety. Then came the night everything reached the breaking point. It was a humid evening, the air thick and heavy, when Max began to bark, a sharp, urgent sound he rarely made. I rushed to the window and froze. There, in my backyard, a shadow moved. Someone had scaled the fence and was creeping toward the house. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator assured me officers were on their way, but every second felt like an eternity. Max growled low, his body tense, standing between me and the sliding glass door. The figure moved closer, the dim light from a nearby street lamp catching just enough to reveal the outline of a woman. My stomach dropped. It was Karen. Before she could get closer, the sound of sirens split the night. Red and blue lights flashed across the street as police cars screeched to a stop. Karen froze, caught mid-step, her face illuminated in the headlights. For a moment, she looked less like the tyrant who had tormented me for months and more like someone unhinged, consumed by her own obsession. The officers swarmed the yard, pulling her away as she shouted incoherently. Words spilled from her in fragments, claims that Max was dangerous, that she was protecting the neighborhood, that I was lying about everything. None of it made sense, but all of it was captured in the body cameras the officers wore. They escorted her away in handcuffs, her protests echoing into the night. I stood there, Max at my side, trembling not from fear anymore, but from the adrenaline of finally seeing the truth laid bare. Karen's breaking point had come, and she had crossed a line she could never return from. In the days that followed, the neighborhood was a whirlwind. News of Karen's arrest spread quickly. Some neighbors expressed shock, others relief, but nearly everyone admitted they had seen the signs. The woman who once strutted through the community with pride and authority had been exposed as someone willing to commit crimes to enforce her obsession. The police reports, combined with my documentation, painted a clear picture of harassment, vandalism, and trespassing. Charges were filed. For the first time, the burden of defense wasn't on me. It was on her. But even as justice began to move forward, I couldn't shake the feeling of fragility. The fight had taken so much out of me. The weeks of letters, the fines, the harassment, the isolation. It had all worn me down. Yet through it all, Max had remained constant, his calm presence anchoring me. He had been my strength, my shield, my proof that I wasn't alone. And now, as Karen faced consequences of her own making, I realized the story wasn't just about a battle with a neighbor or an HOA. It was about resilience, about refusing to back down when someone tried to strip away something essential, about standing tall even when the odds seemed stacked against me. Karen had tried to ban my dog. She had tried to break me. Instead, she had broken herself. But the story wasn't over yet. There was still the matter of the courts, of restitution, of making sure nothing like this could ever happen again. The breaking point had been reached. But what came next would determine whether the neighborhood would finally find peace, or whether the embers of Karen's chaos would linger long after she was gone. The weeks following Karen's arrest felt surreal. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, I could step outside without bracing myself for confrontation. No more letters slipped under my door. No more threats disguised as notices. No more glares from the porch 3 houses down. The quiet was disorienting, almost unnatural, as though the entire community was exhaling after months of tension. But beneath the calm, the aftermath of Karen's spiral was still unfolding. Her arrest for trespassing and harassment had made her the subject of gossip across the entire subdivision. Some neighbors avoided talking about it, embarrassed they had ever supported her campaigns. Others whispered openly, recounting stories of her past outbursts, realizing this wasn't the first time her obsession with control had gone too far. For years, Karen had managed to cloak her behavior under the guise of protecting the neighborhood. But now the curtain had been ripped away. What remained was the truth. She wasn't a guardian of order. She was a bully. The HOA board, shaken to its core, scrambled to distance themselves from her. Within days of her arrest, they released a formal statement condemning her actions and promising reforms. It was a hollow gesture, given how complicit they had been, but it was also proof of how desperate they were to salvage their reputation. Board members who once echoed Karen's demands now tiptoed around me with nervous politeness, clearly worried about what else I might reveal. But I wasn't interested in politeness. I was interested in accountability. With the support of disability rights advocates, I filed formal complaints not only against Karen, but against the HOA itself. Every fine, every unlawful demand, every discriminatory letter. It all became part of a case that moved beyond the boundaries of our neighborhood. The law was clear. Service animals could not be restricted, and retaliation against their handlers was a direct violation of federal protections. The HOA had crossed the line repeatedly, and the consequences would be severe. The legal process was slow but steady. While Karen faced her own charges for vandalism, trespassing, and harassment, the HOA found itself under investigation. State officials demanded policy revisions, mandatory training, and compliance oversight. What once felt like a fortress of authority crumbled under scrutiny, its leaders humbled and afraid. Through it all, Max remained my anchor. His steady presence reminded me daily why the fight had mattered so much. Without him, I might have caved to the pressure, paid the fines, or even considered moving. But with him at my side, I stood firm. And now, as I walked him through the neighborhood, there was no longer fear in the stares of my neighbors. There was respect. Sometimes even quiet gratitude, because whether they admitted it or not, my battle had changed the community for everyone. As for Karen, her downfall was as dramatic as her campaign had been. With pending charges and a restraining order filed against her, she withdrew from neighborhood life completely. Her once pristine yard grew untended, her porch sat empty, and her house became a symbol of what unchecked obsession could do. Rumors swirled that she was considering moving, unable to face the community she had once tried to control. Justice had been served, but it didn't feel like victory in the way I expected. There was no celebration, no triumphant moment of glory. Instead, there was relief. Relief that the harassment had ended, relief that Max was safe, relief that the neighborhood could finally breathe again. In the end, the lesson was clear. Karen had believed she was untouchable because she had the HOA behind her. She thought rules and intimidation could override compassion and common sense. She thought she could strip away something essential from me and face no consequences. But she was wrong. What she failed to understand was that the law protects those who need it most, and more importantly, that determination and truth will always outlast control and fear. Looking back, I realized the fight had never just been about Karen or even the HOA. It had been about proving to myself and to everyone watching that no one has the right to decide what's essential in someone else's life. Max wasn't just my dog. He was my partner, my guardian, my lifeline. And no neighbor, no association, no self-proclaimed enforcer could take that away. As the sun set one evening, I sat on my porch with Max stretched out at my feet, his head resting calmly on his paws. The street was quiet, the air still. For the first time since moving in, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. The war with Karen and the HOA was over, and while scars remained, spray-painted fences, sleepless nights, the echoes of whispered accusations, they were reminders not of defeat, but of resilience. Karen had tried to ban my dog. She had tried to ban a part of me. Instead, she had banned herself, and in her absence, the neighborhood was finally free. The saga is complete. Karen's obsession destroyed her, the HOA was forced to reform, and the bond between man and service dog endured stronger than ever.